Hey everybody, Ty here. I hope everyone is doing well. So, in recent time, we talked about the wintry side or potential wintry side of the upcoming pattern change that we have here. Now, we're going to kind of talk about the severe side. We already talked about the temperatures we're going to be expecting over the rest of the week and heading into the weekend, even at this point. And you see a great example of that here. Warm air continuing to dominate over the southern states and even towards the desert southwest. I would expect that to continue throughout the day. Now, one thing that we will be paying attention to more, especially with the severe weather side of things, is this day 3 slight risk that has been issued. In case you might have missed it, we're mainly looking at the Ohio valleys and even parts of the Tennessee Valley coming into play here. It's going to be a pretty small corridor. We would expect the potential for strong to severe thunderstorms to be greatest, but it could extend as far north, maybe even as Ohio and into southern parts of Alabama and maybe even Mississippi. The main threat I would expect at this point, it would be damaging winds, but few tornadoes can't be ruled out. I would definitely keep an eye out for increased threat for hail as well, mainly due to the fact that we have decent amount of instability. But one of the biggest limiting factors with this setup, and this is kind of highlighted on both the GFS and the Euro, is going to be the large scale ascent, our lift basically. Lift is an important parameter in order to get showers and thunderstorms going, and it's especially important whenever you get severe storms going. You can see the trough beginning to roll in here on both the GFS and the Euro. I'm going to move these back just a little further so that way you can see whenever peak time for storms would be to develop. And I would say that somewhere between the 3 to 7 p.m. Central Time frame would be the point of interest here. But as you can see here, looking at the trough is not very strong. It's not digging down deep. There's no sort of jet streak or wind max to deal with or anything like that, or at least not one of great significance as of right now. These setups still can be pretty sneaky and can cause some dangerous weather too, so don't let your guard down with these. That's one of the points I want to make sure I'm driving home with this. But even so, I expect a pretty narrow window and mainly a line of thunderstorms. If we were to see this trough kind of digging a little deeper, which it still very well could, or the progression ends up being a little bit earlier, then things might get even more interesting in comparison to what we've been seeing. But even so, like I said, not much to really pay attention to over here. This little tiny area where you can kind of see these colors kind of light up in the little tiny blotches where it clears out. That's diffluence. That's usually whenever we start to see shower and thunderstorm development as a whole. You can kind of see it up towards Ohio as well and sneaking across parts of Kentucky and Tennessee at this point. Euro kind of shows it as well, but it's not in as much prominence as the GFS, which honestly this isn't even showing a whole lot. And you can kind of see that continuing into the evening and maybe even into the overnight hours for a brief period before we watch that move out by mid-morning, maybe early afternoon. And the same thing can pretty much be said for the Euro. In fact, it looks like the progression with that is even faster. But in regards to the cool down too, and this is also going to play a huge factor in our severe weather setup also, is the Euro just seems like it starts to progress more as that trough begins to dig further southward. So the Euro's been showing more of an aggressive cool down as a result of that, but the GFS, its progression is a little bit slower. So we're kind of going back and forth here between these two models. You can see again, GFS keeps that cold air a little bit further towards the north, whereas the Euro is pushing it a little further south. You can kind of see the difference as to how the trough is digging. We pretty much have cleared Illinois at this point towards the central point of the trough, which is right about here, whereas with this, we're a little bit further up towards the north. This is going to be a little bit of a trickier setup. I don't think we'll gain a lot of clarity maybe until the day of, if even then. So from that point, we're going to kind of focus strictly on the GFS from this point since we're talking severe weather here. And what I want you to pay attention to here are these little details here, these little contours that have kind of popped up. This can get pretty hard to see considering the state line, so I'm going to circle them for you. So the main area that I'm paying attention to is this pocket that develops right around here. Pretty good circle for me, by the way. Got to give myself a pat on the back sometimes. But it's this area right here where I see a couple of short waves develop, and I think this is where our strongest storms will be. This lines up pretty well with that slight risk, but some of these other areas that I mentioned before, the short waves don't pop up immediately, but if we were to take a look at this about a run or two down the line, this is when you start to see those weaker short waves kind of popping up here and the storm threat kind of propagating a little bit further off towards the east. Again, as I mentioned before, by the time we get towards mid-morning, early afternoon, a lot of the activity is essentially done. So I don't expect a risk for Saturday. Maybe they might have a continuation of the slight risk as a marginal risk early in the day if there is enough energy to be left over. But again, that's kind of a tricky setup considering the details behind our conditions. And as far as like some of the other parameters for Saturday is concerned, I wouldn't expect a whole lot out of that. Really, there's not a whole lot of other parameters that are giving this setup a big hand in regards to its potential here. One of the more prominent features I would say is the moisture, but even then it's a little bit on the marginal side. We're getting into the 60-degree dew point range, so we have moisture kind of feeding into these storms. The forcing is kind of weak though, so it could make for a messier convective mode as well. But even so, that's two parameters that we can talk about that's checked off at this juncture. So if we were to shift our attention to the low-level jet, which is always the tornado juice as we like to call it here, it kind of comes in later into the evening here. But if and only if we can get any storms that can take advantage of that, that's when that tornado threat becomes a little bit more prominent, because we do have sufficient low-level jet here. We're above the 30 knot range here. We're actually looking at about 37 to maybe even 40 knots in a couple of places as well. If we can get storms to fire around this time, things get a little bit more interesting. Even so, it's kind of a gamble as to whether or not we get anything forming during peak time, and this is the time that I selected here. We just don't really have anything going at this time. I think our storm threat kind of picks up a little bit later into the afternoon, so I'm going to do a little bit more in the way of refinement as we go later into the evening. Even so, like I said, it's pretty marginal at this point and kind of a gamble as to whether or not this even does anything. But nonetheless, it's something to keep an eye on. So I guess now we'll go ahead and take a look at those surface temperatures, which is going to be another key dynamic. And this kind of shows either the strength or lack thereof within a trough sometimes, or frontal boundary. And we just don't really see a prominent boundary kind of forming up here. You see our 70s and our 80-degree temperatures here. And right along, and you can tell where the warm front kind of cuts off, but there's not a big gradient. And what I mean by gradient is essentially whenever you see a frontal boundary like this kind of occurring, you'll see the colder temperatures, like let's say the 40s and 50s, more prominently. Like this is a pretty good example here. But where we're expecting our severe weather, we just don't really see that. There's actually a little bit of a break here where we see those warmer temperatures up towards the 60s and 70s here, and then you see those 30s and 40s here. So it's usually a good indicator of lift whenever you would see something like that along a frontal boundary, and it's just not really there. So again, just one of those things where timing just isn't really coming together. Nothing's really intersecting in such a way to where we would have a significant setup of any like at this point. Now, one other factor that could throw a wrinkle into things is we do have that little trough that is able to draw in a little bit of instability. And I would say at this point, given what I'm seeing here, towards maybe southern Tennessee might have the best mixing together to produce a tornado threat, and here's a verification of that with the sounding. So again, it's all about how everything really comes together with severe weather. It's not one particular parameter that you would look at. So a lot we're going to have to pay attention to, but even with this, I see some parameters that are also lacking. Big part is this little LI right here. That's lift index, and we've already pretty much talked you to death about that. So with that in mind, again, I'm not expecting a whole lot in the way of coverage, but there could be a couple more notable storms in particular. And then as we look towards Saturday, as I mentioned before, not much in the way of instability. A lot of the forcing is too far to the north where there is instability, so I would expect minor activity over here towards the Gulf, towards the Atlantic coast, I would say at this point, towards southeast Georgia and parts of the Carolinas here. And then we'll watch this clear out by the time we move forward into Sunday, and then starting next week, we already know the deal there. So final look at the radar over the next few days here. We're not going to do a full loop here, obviously, since we're mainly focused on Friday. But again, pretty much mentioning our our mode of storms here. Pretty linear, kind of a messier mode here as well. I think forcing really might be one of the big limiting factors with this. But since it was a slight risk that was issued, I figured we'd have to talk about it here. So with that in mind, as we go into the following day, you can see the storm's weakening, and then that's that. And from that point, we'll be shifting our attention back towards the winter weather. We'll see if we need to make any further updates to this, but the main things to prepare for, and you can kind of see it here, there is cold air coming, and for some of you further up towards the north, towards the Great Lakes, there will be potential for some winter weather going forward. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you guys hit that like button and subscribe button if you would, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.